So we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to just spend a little more time with it. What happens if the president dies? And you might think, well, that's really clear. The Constitution says the vice president becomes president. But what happens? Well, that was not maybe as clear as you'd think. That also had to be sort of worked out between the president, between Congress and the courts and the vice president. So the presidential succession those things were finally worked out in detail. It started fairly early, and the question wasn't who wields the executive power if the president dies. That was clear. The vice president assumes the power and responsibilities of the president. What wasn't clear is whether he assumed the title, whether that meant that he is now called the president or is he now called the acting president. And if the vice president becomes president, how do you what happens then to the vice president? Do we not? So for a long time, when the vice president became president, there just wasn't a vice president until the next election could elect a new vice president. So that was seen as problematic. Also, there's the question of incapacitation. If the president is unable to perform his duties, well, who gets to decide if the president is unable to perform his duties? Does the president decide? Does the vice president decide? Does Congress decide? Who gets to decide? In cases of physical incapacity, that may seem irrelevant. If the president is just too sick to do the job, well, that might seem to be fairly obvious, but what if it's a mental incapacity? Do we take the vice president's word for it that the president's gone crazy, I need to take over? That seems subject to abuse. Or if the president has been physically incapacitated, who gets to decide then when he's ready to resume his duties? Again, do we take the president's word for it? Or the vice president who's now wielding power, who is now acting as president? Does he get to decide? So all of those things had to be worked out. And there are two pieces of relevant law. One is the Presidential Succession Law that was passed in 1974, and then the 25th Amendment that was ratified in 1967. These have finally clarified all of those issues. So when the president dies, in most cases, it's pretty clear. The vice president becomes president, and it was pretty early on decided that he becomes president. He doesn't just become acting president. But what happens if the president and the vice president both die? Now, that wasn't something that was foreseen by the framers, but that becomes a distinct possibility in the 1940s when you develop nuclear weapons. Weapons of mass destruction mean it is much more possible that an attack could take out both the president and the vice president. So you needed to decide, what are you going to do? And especially vulnerable, and our government is especially vulnerable at a few key times when you have the president speaking to joint sessions of Congress. So times when you have pretty much the entire government, or at least the executive and the legislature, together in one place, where you've got all the heads of the government. So during the State of the Union address, the president comes to a joint session of Congress. So you've got all the senators, all the representatives, the president, the vice president, and the heads of the executive departments all attend that thing. That might be a very appealing target to enemies who wanted to decapitate our government. Presidential inaugurations similarly bring everybody together. And so what was devised is something called the designated survivor. So part of this succession law, the practice developed that you wouldn't have all of the department heads. There's always one that is not in attendance and is kept in a secure, undisclosed location. And it rotates. It's not always like the same secretary, but it will rotate, but there will always be one cabinet member that is safe and not at the State of the Union address or at any other place where all the other leadership is, so that there will always be somebody to survive to take over in the case that terrible event were to happen. Here is the line of succession. Vice president is first in line. Constitution says that. If the vice president is also killed or unable to serve, the Speaker of the House becomes president. Then the President pro tem of the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary, and it goes down, right? All 15 cabinet secretaries, or is that just 15. 15 cabinet secretaries after the first 3. So vice president and then the leaders of each, the presiding officers of each of the houses of Congress, and then 15 department secretaries. The 25th Amendment clarified the issues about presidential incapacitation. If the president believes he or she is unable to carry out the duties of the office, the president gets to decide and notifies Congress and the vice president, and that I'm unable to do this. Vice president is acting president until I can resume. So that times that has happened. When President Reagan was shot, he was rushed into emergency surgery. During surgery, he had to be put under general anesthesia. He was unconscious and he couldn't be awakened, so he couldn't be relied upon to take decisions. So during that period, he notify Congress, I'm going to be incapacitated. The vice president was acting president. If the president is incapacitated and incapable of notifying Congress, which might actually have been the case when Reagan was shot, then the vice president plus a majority of the cabinet notify Congress. So the vice president can't just seize power alone. He's got to get a majority of the cabinet secretaries to go to agree with him that the president is incapacitated, and then they notify Congress and the vice president assumes the president's responsibilities. If there is a question about whether it's really true, if it looks like this is a coup and the vice president has just gotten cabinet secretaries to go along with him, if there's any question, then a 2/3 vote of Congress is necessary to side with for the vice president to remain acting as president. So this makes a very high bar for anybody trying to just seize power, but a realistically enactable if it's a real situation. Likewise, on resuming activity, when the president says he's ready to resume activity, he notifies Congress, and the vice president can object, and then Congress will make the final decision with supermajority. So the presumption is that the president decides when the president is incapacitated and when he is ready to resume duties, but there is a mechanism for if the president has lost his marbles and can't make that call, can't be trusted to make that call on his own. So I want to give you another extra credit opportunity. What if, we've talked about what happens if the president dies. What if the president-elect dies before taking the office and the oath of office and becoming president? This scenario has not happened yet. There is no precedent, but considering Joe Biden is the oldest president-elect we've ever elected, There's a lot of people talking and speculating about this right now. So given what we have learned about presidential elections, the Electoral College, the certification of the vote in Congress, I want you to think about it and give me your best argument about what you think would happen if the president-elect died at these 3 points. After being elected, but before the Electoral College votes. After the electors vote, but before the votes are officially counted and certified by Congress. And then finally, after Congress certifies the results, but before the inauguration. That one, there is a right answer to. For the others, I have my opinion, but any well-argued opinion will get credit. So, well-argued responses, I will create an assignment where you, in the content folder for this week, where you can upload this to me if you want. Well-argued responses that address all 3 possibilities will replace your lowest score with on an assignment with an A. Even if that lowest score is a 0, I will grant it to you wherever it does you the most good. Just want to see if you can apply what we've learned.